Very quickly, I just want to introduce John Henderschedt, who is the Executive Director of the Fisheries Leadership and Sustainability Forum. That's a partnership between Duke, Stanford, Environmental Defense Fund, Center for Ocean Solutions. And I first observed John a year ago at managing our nation's Fisheries 3 in DC, and was really impressed with his skills as facilitator. And at some point when our steering committee felt like we were stalled a bit, I remembered you, called you up, invited you down to campus, and he really helped us move forward in a great, exciting way. So, John, this is your show now.
So, thank you, David, with that introduction. Before we start the panel, I just have a few introductory remarks to make, both about the focus of this panel and about how we're going to work it. So, given the fact that many of us spend nearly every day in the land of Magnuson-Stevens, it's really easy to take for granted what an incredible, impactful, effective piece of legislation it's been. And, in my view, one of the truly amazing attributes of the Act is the depth of engagement of stakeholders and managers, including fishers and NGOs and trade associations, representatives of state and local government, our regional management councils, and the administration, among others, will engage in its reauthorization, in that process that drives the evolution of this keystone piece of fisheries legislation in the U.S. And that really begs the question of how are all of these diverse and sometimes conflicting and contradictory opinions voiced by a thousand groups and individuals ultimately prioritized, evaluated, sometimes rejected and synthesized into our nation's legislation for managing our fisheries. What is the process that distills this plurality of views into some manner of balance between competing objectives? And so today we're really fortunate to have 4 individuals who know the answer to those questions because they see it and they're part of that process. And they've generously offered to share their observations and perspectives on this process. So we're joined by Jean Flemma, Senior Policy Advisor to the Democratic staff of the House Committee on Natural Resources, by Bob King, a Legislative Assistant in the Office of U.S. Senator Mark Begich, by Nikki Teutschel, a Legislative Assistant in the Office of U.S. Senator Maria Cantwell, and by Dave Whaley, Professional Staff Member with the House Committee on Natural Resources. So our discussion this morning is going to have 3 parts. We're going to start out trying to answer the question of how did we get here? Why are we here in 2014 talking about reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act? The second question we're going to try to answer, at least to some extent, is who is at the table and what is on the table? Really sort of examining what is the narrative that's surrounding MSA reauthorization, what are the issues that seem to be driving it, and how do national perspectives either mirror or differ from those in the Pacific Northwest and the North Pacific. And then finally, where do things go from here? We'll wrap up the panel with a discussion of possible timelines and mileposts. Perhaps examine that question of how all of these diverse interests are ultimately balanced in a piece of legislation, and prospects for reauthorization going forward. So we have a lot to cover in just over an hour, so we're not planning on a Q&A session, but I'm sure that through the dialogue and exchange of our panelists, we'll be able to really illustrate that MSA reauthorization narrative. So without further delay, I'm going to ask Dave to start and ask this question of how did we get here?
Thanks, John. And thank you to the University of Washington for inviting us. This has been great, and the first panel was excellent. Kind of tough to follow. As John said, I drew this short straw, and I get to tell you how we got to where we are so far in this reauthorization, following on the previous speakers. Before I answer that and get into it, I just want to point out something that none of the 4 of us are fishery scientists, or at least not practicing fishery scientists. we're not fishery managers, we deal with policy. So we have to listen to all of you when we're trying to figure out how the act works and how to make changes. And so all of your input over the years has been very helpful in all three of the reauthorizations that we've been talking about today. One of the reasons Congress puts authorization dates into acts is so that there's a requirement that we relook at an act after a certain amount of time. The current Magnuson-Stevens acts actually expired at the end of fiscal year 2013, so we're a little bit behind in reauthorizing it. So far, the House Committee on Natural Resources has held 9 hearings over the last 3 years, looking at different reauthorization issues and looking at fishery management, federal fishery management in general. We've had hearings that were chaired by the full committee chairman, who is Doc Hastings from Washington, who you're going to hear from right after the lunch break, but also by our subcommittee chairman, John Fleming from Louisiana. So very different perspectives, different parts of the country, so a little different focus in some of the hearings. We've heard from, so far in the last 3 years, 76 different witnesses, including the administration, states, councils, commissions, and a whole wide variety of stakeholders. As Margaret mentioned in her talk, there were a number of National Academy studies in the last reauthorization. There's been momentum along the same lines in this reauthorization. A lot of stuff going on outside of Congress. The Managing Our Nation's Fisheries 3 conference was hosted by the 8 regional fishery management councils. Each of the councils prior to the conference submitted a list of things that were working in their region, things that weren't working, and recommendations for reauthorization. The conference then discussed a lot of those in great detail, which was very, very helpful to us. And then the result of the conference was 128 recommendations on how to improve fishery management, not just the act, but a lot of those were specific to reauthorization. Following the conference, there was the release of a new National Academy of Sciences study on rebuilding flexibility, again, very helpful to our discussions. On top of that, the MAFAC, which is an advisory committee to the Secretary, has come out with a number of recommendations and reports. Again, we've taken those into consideration. And on top of that, the CCC, I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, the Council Consultative Committee, which is all the regional council chairman, vice chairman, and executive directors get together twice a year. And the Magnuson Act reauthorization has been a significant topic of conversation for that group. And some of us have been able to participate in those discussions as well. So we've been getting a lot of feedback from all 8 councils as a group. We took all of these recommendations, sat down with the chairman, and we grouped them by issue areas, and we also grouped them by region. And we went through with the chairman and decided which he was comfortable with doing, which we thought members of our committee, at least on the Republican side, would want us to do. And we put together a draft, a discussion draft, which was circulated in December. A lot of you have commented on that. We've gotten a lot of comments in. Following that, the chairman has been meeting with the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio from Oregon, to see where there are areas of agreement, where there are areas of compromise, where there are areas we just might disagree. In addition, Gene and I have sat down a number of times to do the same discussions. We brought in Sam a couple times to help out from the administration perspective. And following that, we're going to try and move this bill. So if that gives you a little flavor of where we are.
Thanks, Dave. Bob, if you'd like to make similar comments from the Senate side?
Sure, and I'd also like to echo Dave's sentiments to the University of Washington for putting on this Bevan lecture series. It's very valuable, very timely to bring up Magnuson-Stevens right now. And I won't repeat much of what Dave said. I don't have Dave's lengthy experience on Capitol Hill. I came there when Senator Begich was elected 5 years ago, But I have a longer experience in Alaska fisheries from various perspectives since the late 70s, and saw Magnuson-Stevens as it was first being implemented and changed, and watched it grow as the dynamic, economic and resource conservation engine that it is, which is very powerful. And so I have a pretty good background on that, and followed the past reauthorization efforts, and it's actually interesting now working on the Hill and jumping into a number of these issues. When I first got there about 5 years ago, I was immediately struck by the number of issues that were still out there, even though the latest reauthorization had just passed a few years ago. There were, and it really run the gamut from the North Pacific, where people were very happy about the way Magnuson was being implemented and how things were operating. Always issues among fishermen, don't get me wrong, but they were pleased overall with the progress that was being made and how it was working. To the New England issues, which talked about earlier in the historical context, which were part of an issue back when Magnuson-Stevens was first passed back in the 70s, and are still today. There were several rallies up on the Hill of fishermen who were seeking the complete overthrow of, complete repeal of Magnuson-Stevens. And you can get I think, perspectives anywhere in between. Or discussion about a lot of these various issues. And initially, when these things came up in 09 and 2010, I was happy to say, well, Magnuson's not up for reauthorization right now, so we can kind of defer. But the time clock passed, and here it is before us. And Senator Begich, who's now chair of the Commerce Subcommittee on Oceans and Fisheries, knew it was his responsibility. We moved forward, informed by things such as the Council Coordinating Committee discussions and the like, or discussions with NIMS officials and others, hearing from constituents constantly. I learned more about summer flounder and red snapper issues than I ever thought, but learning more about the history of Magnuson, it's not surprising at all in that context. We listened to a lot of the, not only our constituents, but recognizing its national importance from constituents across the country, and went through a very similar process of creating a list, working through issues, listening to what the CCC had to say, listening to what the councils and the chairs had to say, listening to the discussion at the Managing Our Nation's Fisheries 3 conference, which was an excellent broad discussion of the issues that are before us today. Then Senator Begich and Ranking Member Rubio on the subcommittee decided to hold a series of hearings. We held 4 hearings focusing on the New England, Mid-Atlantic, Atlantic coast fisheries, Gulf fisheries, Pacific, and eventually one for the North Pacific fisheries, to bring in perspectives from the regional administrators from NIMS, as well as others, as well as stakeholders, to get their comments about where we need to go. We came up from that process, from all the other input. Senator Begich also conducted 9 different listening sessions, sort of informal field hearings while he was traveling around. Many were in the state of Alaska, focusing on the commercial recreational subsistence issues and the like that are important to our stakeholders. But also similar discussions in Boston and elsewhere at the request of other members to hear from their constituents. From that process, we put together our own discussion draft based on our internal conversations, our work with Senator Rubio on what was important from his perspective, and came up with a discussion draft that has created a certain amount of discussion, which is exactly what it was intended to do. And we get in more of the details, more details later, but this is the process. And I sort of refer back to the timeline that Margaret showed of the previous reauthorizations, sort of the timeline of the bill comes up for reauthorization, similar process with hearings that go through, drafts are circulated, reports are received, Events such as this occur, managing our nation's fisheries occur, and it goes through. I think right now we're at the beginning of that process, and look forward to actually further discussion.
Thank you, Bob. Jean, would you like to add to the discussion?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we have about 2 more years because we're on the 10-year cycle, and 2016 would make us right on 96, 2006, 2016. So Dave, you got plenty of time. Plenty of time. My name's Jean Flemma, and I'm a UW grad myself. Thank you very much for having me back. I was at School of Marine Affairs. That was its name 2 times ago, right, Dave? It's had 2 name changes since then. Professor Fluharty, Ed Miles, Mark Hirschman, Dr. Lachine were all my professors, and so it's really it's great for me to be back. And the first panel this morning was like sort of the story of my life for the past 20-some years, though Bud Walsh, I was also not born when some of those things you were talking about were started. But I did want to say, after I graduated from the UW, I went to Washington. Penny tried to make me her mini-me, but I went to the House instead. And you didn't hear a lot about the House of Representatives this morning. You only heard about the Senate. That's so typical of Senate staffers, okay? So typical. Like, listening to Bud Walsh, you would think there was no House bill, okay? In the legislative process, for those of you who don't know, a bill has to pass the Senate and the House, okay? Not just one body. And my boss, my first boss on Capitol Hill was Congressman Gary Studs from Massachusetts, who Penny did mention. Thank you, Penny. And he was with Congressman Young, who's one of Dave's bosses. They were the champions for the passage of that bill in the House because Gary Studs, being from Massachusetts, his fishermen could see the boats that Bud talked about off the shore. And so he himself was a long champion of the fishing industry and was a champion of the passage of the act. But when it came to the 90s, as Penny and Margaret talked about, and the idea that we needed to look at what wasn't working and the problems that we were having in New England, you know, I think about Studs and Young working together on that bill, and then the paths separated at that point. The bill was passed, and then, as we all heard, North Pacific went one way, New England went another way. And we've all talked about that. We don't need to rehash that. But I think all of that and the reforms that we put in place in 96 and 2006 are so critical to why we have the success that we have today that Sam Rauch talked about at the end of the panel. That the things that we put in place, like catch limits, like ending overfishing, like rebuilding requirements, here's a good one, like the fact that the council should not be able to exceed MSY when setting a catch limit, which seems so obvious now, but before 96, as somebody talked about, they could do that, and in New England, we did on a regular basis. And unbelievably, we have people in New England who are now advocating that we should change the law back and let them exceed MSY for social and economic reasons. So as we move forward into the discussion of what's going to happen now, I think it's really, really important, and it was so valuable to have that initial reflection of how we got to where we were, because I think a lot of people feel that the act is working and obviously there's adjustments that could be made, but that our fisheries are doing very well, and we want to build on that, not go back and undermine some of the things that some councils, unfortunately, are not as, how should I put it, as able as the North Pacific Council to rebuff those sort of political and socioeconomic pressures. And we want to be sure we avoid going back to a time when those pressures are back on the councils and they can do those things. So I just wanted to throw that out there. House staff, not Senate, you know.
Thank you. And Nikki, I'd like to invite you to add some comments if you have some.
Sure. Well, I'm Nikki Teutschel. I work for Senator Marie Cantwell. She's a former Ocean Subcommittee chair in the Senate, Jean, and but she's now just a senior member on the Commerce Committee. So she obviously hears a lot from a lot of people in this room. I don't know if there's hardly any strangers in here. But also she's still, from her time on the subcommittee, she very much cares about fishing issues and is very proud to come from Washington State, where we have so many sustainable world-class fisheries, both based here, all based here, but here and up in Alaska. So I don't want to go talk more about the process, but I guess I will say, as a senior member of the Commerce Committee, or one of the senior members, and representing a personal office, we do have a little bit more of a state-based perspective. So I think that's kind of why I'm here today.
Great.
Yeah.
And we look forward to hearing
Yeah.
that, and the sort of the contrast that we've heard about throughout the discussions this morning. So now that we've kind of evaluated how we got here, why we're here, let's talk about who is at the table and what is on the table. And I guess we'll start with some of these hallmark management measures that were discussed throughout the panel this morning. Things like rebuilding schedule requirements and the role of the SSC in establishing an ABC that limits where the council can establish its catch limits. I've heard in a lot of discussions the need for flexibility, and so I guess I will toss out to this group, to what extent are some of these hallmark management measures on the table, and to what extent has this issue of flexibility entered the discussion, and how might that be addressed? What are you hearing from stakeholders in different regions? And I guess lastly then, how do what you hear from different regions square with what you hear from the Pacific Northwest or the West Coast, North Pacific? Who'd like to start? Dave?
Yes, the rebuilding flexibility and the ACL flexibility have been large issues in our hearings. We started reauthorization hearings in 2011, and there were a couple of things that became very loud and clear for a lot of what our members were hearing. Number one was that the previous reauthorization had, as previous speakers talked about, implemented the Alaska model. And what we heard through the hearings very early on was the Alaska model is great, but Alaska has great data, and they have annual stock assessments, they have robust surveys that are done. There's a lot of both fishery independent and fishery dependent data that's used. Other regions don't have that. There's a significant lack of data. And when the National Standard 1 guidelines were implemented following the 2006 amendments, there was a significant amount of buffering that was put in, both for scientific uncertainty and for management uncertainty. So in areas like the South Atlantic and the Gulf, where you have very little stock assessment work, these buffers were huge. And so they were seeing, some of the fishery managers were telling us they were seeing significant economic impacts on communities because of the large buffers. And the Alaska model just didn't quite fit. So what they wanted was more flexibility. So we've heard a lot about that. Question is, this is a national act. We need to balance what works well in some regions with what doesn't work well in others without lowering the bar too far. As Gene said, we don't want to see New England backslide. But when you have 70% cuts in some of the major fisheries, do we want to see an industry in New England anymore? And if we don't provide some flexibility, are we going to have a fishing industry in New England? So those are things that we have to balance, and we'll probably have some differences of opinion between the House and the Senate, between Republicans and Democrats on that issue, but that's something we need to try and balance.
Let's test that theory about differences of opinion.
Yeah. Is this on? Well, I think it's important to note that the word flexibility means something very different here in Seattle and in Alaska and up and down the West Coast than it does back east. So figuring out how we address some of these concerns and be respectful of, protecting coastal economies and fishing dependent communities, while also making sure that we're, protecting what's worked here. And I liked what you said about the differences in science and availability of high quality, like stock assessment data, for example. And I think that that's something we should think about, We need to protect all of the wonderful science that's happening here, and there's probably some more that we could do. I know I hear that from you guys a lot. But let's talk about what other fisheries need data, why they need it, when they need it, how often they need it, and let's make sure that we get those resources there. That's something that my boss has been focused on a lot in the committee. And I know that it's a little frustrating, poor Sam Rauch has been on the other side of these questions with my boss a number of times, But we actually need some estimates of how much it's going to cost to meet that bar nationally. What do we need? What kind of investment do we need? What kind of cooperative research tools and availability do we need to make sure that we actually can get the science to make things work back east a little better and in the Gulf? So that's what I would say. I wouldn't want to, the precautionary principle, yes, there's a little wiggle room there, and there's some really surgical edits and ideas that we have to make that as smooth as possible, and that's something that, you know, we're all interested in talking about. But at the same time, you know, that's one of the things, that general principle is something that has put Alaska, you know, first. And I know a lot of members have been talking about how important it is to protect it, and my boss is definitely one of them.
Other comments on this issue?
I agree that one of the key fundamental things we need to do is increase funding for added research, for stock assessment and the like. There are even though differences and agreements about how to do that, how to achieve the funding, and you'll see in the various draft, in our discussion draft, you know, some ideas that Senator Rubio has about moving forward on that. There are concerns, I mean, even among other members, just about the implications of that, however. So it's all part of this discussion that needs to go further. We weighed, too, the comments that Dave said, and we heard loud and clear from members and others, fishermen on the East Coast, just about the lack of science and the lack of data, how that played into how these limits were set. In the Senate discussion draft that we put out, we added a slight amount of flexibility, the T-min plus 1 mean generation standard, which actually is the standard that's been incorporated for many years. But that's where we see it right at this point. But there is going to be a discussion in the House draft that's out there. There's obviously going to be a broad different perspectives on this, and it'll be part of the debate as this moves forward.
Jean, would you?
I would just say that I think a lot of where we hear about the need for more flexibility is from the places where the hardest management decisions have had to be made, and in the North Pacific, that really wasn't something that we were hearing a lot about. And I understand the idea that, you know, without good data, we have to have bigger buffers, but the idea that without good data, you would want to be more lenient, I think for a lot of people is a concern, and I think it gives people concern that we would perhaps go too close to that edge of overfishing again in some fisheries, which could, again, take us back down a road we don't want to go. I think, for instance, Dave, I think you said the 70%, that's the New England cut that Sam mentioned. That was devastating, but they can't even catch that quota now. With the 70% cut, they still can't catch the quota. And so we could double it. We could double that quota tomorrow, and they would not be able to catch it. So we have a bigger problem, and I think that has to do with the climate change effects and other things that are coming into play in some of these fisheries that we need more data on it, as we were saying. And I think that a lot of people believe that there is flexibility in the law now. I mean, even the 10-year rebuilding timeline, which has become sort of a you hate it or love it situation. I think it's 50%, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, at least 50% of the stocks exceed that 10-year rebuilding timeline now, so it is not a hard number. It is a flexible number. But so I think there's one person's flexibility is another person's return to the bad old days, and so I think that will be really where a lot of the debate occurs.
Thank you. Related to harvest limits is the question of forage species. And at the Manage Our Nation's Fisheries Conference, there was a session on forage fish management, and the findings that came out of that session ranged from adoption of best practices to, you know, things that might be achieved through reauthorization. So I'll ask the group, is forage fish management an issue that's on the table at this point in the reauthorization discussion?
Not in the House bill.
Well, we jump right into it. Obviously, in the discussion of and a lot of the focus on ecosystem management and the like that took place in Month, it's a big focus here at this Bevan series and the like. A lot of work I know has been done towards ecosystem management as we move forward. in sort of extending the logical growth and extension of that. I know the North Pacific Council, other councils have worked on this, and frankly struggled, because it's a complicated issue of how to incorporate this, while not only protecting the resource itself, the general resource, but also protecting the economic values that are so important. The fisheries that, in the case of, just referring back to Alaska, the fisheries that are sustainable, and the like. How do you incorporate that? In our discussion draft we put out, and I'm sure you've all seen by now that there was proposed language defining that, proposed mention of the forage fish standards, and it was in that context that came up. I will tell you that, except for the Rhode Island Council seat on the Mid-Atlantic, that the forage fish was one of the first items that has come up and brought to our attention. We've heard loud and clear that some of the proposed language that we put forward would not just complicate the situation, give Bud a lot more work, and others. But that's something that we want to avoid. I will tell you that Senator Begich, in discussing this over the past week or so, he's told me that he wants to pull that language out of the act as it moves forward. Although we'd like to continue this discussion to see how we can not only enhance the sort of the ecosystem management issues, and how forage fish may factor into that.
Thank you. Other comments on this topic?
I'll just go real quick. Sam talked a little bit about litigation and the concern that there has been, especially after the Sustainable Fisheries Act, that the amount of litigation skyrocketed. One of the concerns is that some of the language that was proposed on forage fish, creating new mandates that councils take forage fish into account when setting harvest levels for other species and for low trophic level species, looked like a litigation hook to us. So there was some concern about how to deal with that. So we did not address it in our bill. We also heard from the council coordinating committee that a number of the councils are already taking into account forage fish, and that there was not necessarily a need to put something new in the act to encourage them to do that.
Thank you. Keeping with the sort of the ecosystem focus, in some regions right now, impacts of climate change on fish and on fisheries are receiving a lot of attention, and in other regions, not so much attention. To what extent have impacts of climate change entered into the reauthorization discussions from your perspective?
Well, this is somewhat tangential. Last time around, there was a study on ocean acidification, potential impacts on fisheries, and that's not a regulatory thing. That's a let's keep our eyes open and see what might be coming thing, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, where we've seen such disastrous die-offs of shellfish. My boss, Senator Cantwell, spent a lot of time being successful in acquiring funding for sensors and monitoring equipment, so we can at least have the data to know what's going on out there. She feels pretty strongly, she said in a couple of hearings now, that it might be time to go back and look at some of that science. And Magnuson-Stevens is a vehicle for that, for the purpose of we want to understand what that means for coastal economies. And so it's not clear what that means for finfish and things like that, but there's a lot of great work going on with king crab up in Alaska, supporting that work and making sure that people are thinking about, as we're deploying sensors, let's talk to fishermen and talk to councils and figure out where those sensors might be needed most for commercially valuable species. That might be something that we should be thinking about in the next Magnuson bill, and I know Senator Cantwell and Senator Begich have been talking about that a lot, so hopefully we'll get there. But as far as the larger climate change stuff, I think that might be more, I think there's still a lot of science that needs to happen.
Well, I'll just say that
Yeah.
in the House, if you ever watch a House hearing, you'll know that we have a lot of members that still don't even think climate change is happening. So it becomes a little more complicated to talk about, incorporating climate change into legislation. So we tend to talk about changing environmental conditions and other things like that, so we can actually push through to talking, the problem. And I think New England is an example of where clearly changing environmental conditions are having an effect. And that, again, is for the councils, the larger management challenge that they face now is how do they factor those things into their management plans and into their decision making. And that, again, comes back to the issue of needing more stock assessment data, more ecosystem data, because they're not going to be able to make those management decisions if they don't know where the fish are going based on the changing situation. So it's not clear if it's a legislative thing as opposed to something where we need to be getting more resources for that type of understanding for managers.
Other comments? And then one last issue under the question of ecosystem level management. I have not heard a lot of discussion having to do with habitat. It was a big part of previous reauthorizations. Is that because there are, is habitat sort of off the table this time around? What have you been hearing from constituents about habitat concerns in terms of habitat protection, rehabilitation, or scientific research? Is it an issue at a national level today?
I'll just say that I think from the standpoint of some of the NGO community, they're very concerned about the idea that we need to look more at habitat protections in the fisheries management process, not just habitat impacts of fisheries, but the habitat impacts of other activities on fisheries. And I think the fishing industry in many cases would appreciate the idea that we are looking more at the impacts of other activities on fish and not just what they're doing to the fish. I know on the West Coast, one of the issues that my boss, Mr. DeFazio from Oregon, is very concerned about is there's a lot of discussion about energy development on the West Coast, and there's discussions of siting, and the fishing industry isn't necessarily at the table in the discussions about where projects are going to be sited, and this is either renewable or non-renewable. And so I think that in terms of habitat, it's a broader discussion that a lot of members are interested in talking about, but I haven't really seen as much in the legislative side of things.
At least not in terms of changes. I think there are already strong provisions that are in Magnuson-Stevens, and I think the councils are working proactively on the West Coast and elsewhere to try to address those and incorporate those concerns as they move forward.
From my perspective, I think one of the biggest issues has been the lack of science. When NOAA came out with the rules on dealing with essential fish habitat, they ranked the knowledge base on those fisheries, and I can't remember which way it goes, but the worst level was very little about the habitat needs, so everywhere the fish is likely to be is considered habitat. I don't see that we've gotten a lot further along on that, and unfortunately one of the concerns that my members constantly have is funding. We don't see the federal budget going up, so there are so many funding needs for science and fisheries that we need to try and figure out where the biggest needs are. And right now, habitat is not, people have not been calling for habitat science to be the #1 priority.
So moving to the issue of allocation, always a popular issue in the world of Magnuson-Stevens. More recently, certainly at the Council Coordination Committee level, we've heard about allocation review. Not just policy about allocations, but policies about going back and reviewing allocations. How is that entering into the discussions on reauthorization, and what forms might that take?
I'll take the first shot at that. That tends to be more of a regional issue. In the Gulf of Mexico, there's been a huge cry for reallocation, especially of red snapper. The council acted just a few months ago to actually reallocate red snapper. So I think there's current authority within the act for councils to proactively look at allocation issues and make reallocations if they want to. So I don't think that there's necessarily a need for us to amend the act to force councils to do that.
In the Senate discussion draft, there is, however, a provision that would provide for the councils to periodically review allocation levels and the like. This is in response to increasing concerns, obviously, from recreational fishermen, not only in the Gulf. I mean, these have been growing issues in Alaska itself and the like. We put that forward as for part of the discussion, since it's certainly out there. There was a recreational saltwater report that came out among others, which was, and this was one of their top recommendations. It's one that in our discussion with Senator Rubio, he wanted to see move forward. I'll tell you right off, however, that I know it's very controversial even within our own state. A lot of work over the past almost 20 years has gone into addressing halibut, changing demographics, changing uses of halibut, the growth of the recreational charter industry and the like. How do we move forward? We've largely deferred again to the council in this process. They've worked for over 20 years, I think it's been, since this issue first came up, to come up with a plan that was just finally enacted. But we recognize this is an issue and is one that has to be part of the discussion.
Other comments? Gene? No. Oh, okay. And not necessarily as an allocation issue, but certainly looking at user groups. Sam mentioned in his comments this morning, after referring to commercial and recreational, also subsistence. And it's probably it is probably a regional issue, but again, to what extent has that entered the discussion?
Well, perhaps one of the top concerns that we heard during the listening sessions throughout the Alaska was for the need for stronger subsistence or tribal representation on the council, the need to address those issues. Again, these are tough issues, and we're wrestling with them. In the discussion draft, you will see that the word tribal and subsistence is sort of written largely throughout it, so that when councils address issues, look at fishery management plans and the like, they need to consider those impacts and the like. Now, I think the councils have already been doing that. I think the North Pacific Council has paid very, very close attention. A lot of this is being heightened right now by the decline of Chinook salmon in western Alaska, but also more broadly throughout Alaska, Cook Inlet and elsewhere. Whether that's happening due to other fishing impacts, or whether it's due to climate change or what, it isn't known. But throughout the years, we've heard a strong need for the impacts of how Magnuson and in its implementation, how that may impact subsistence needs and supplies is an important issue. And again, we put this forward for discussion. There are concerns, however, about what are potential unintended consequences. How might this impact? I know there are a lot of other tribal and subsistence issues elsewhere in the nation, in the Western Pacific and the like. So we want people to discuss this, and we're interested in hearing from people.
And is there a strong sort of regional bias? What are you hearing from other regions that may have different sensitivities, different concerns about subsistence participation? Is it? Can you characterize that?
Again, most of this is coming from Alaska, but I know there are certainly tribal fisheries here in the state of Washington. There are tribal fisheries elsewhere. There are similar impacts in the Western Pacific. I've heard from tribes in the New England area about other related concerns. They're all very different, but I think you're correct in that it's largely in the North Pacific, West Pacific.
There was a recommendation from the Western Pacific Council to also look at subsistence issues, and we're looking forward to also hearing the comments on the Senate discussion draft on those issues.
I would just say on the House Natural Resources Committee, we also have all the delegates from Guam, American Samoa, CNMI, and they, obviously, that is an issue that's very important to them. So I at some point, I think it'll factor into our discussions.
So for the last part of this discussion about who's at the table and what's on the table, I'd like to look at a couple of process issues. One is, as Bud mentioned in his talk, very early on in his talk, he referred to the development of the council process as developing a very democratic approach to fisheries management. Part of the discussion around this reauthorization has been access and transparency, taking the form of requirements, potential requirements for web streaming and transcripts, and sort of raising the bar in terms of access to the process. And I was hoping that you might be able to comment on what's driving that and what you're hearing about that. Dave? Again,
I don't think any of the concerns about transparency are reflective of either the North Pacific or the Pacific Council. A lot of what we heard, again, was coming from the East Coast, South Atlantic in particular, and the Gulf, where the SSC tended to do things, I won't say in secrecy, but there was not the level of transparency or interaction that we have here in the Northwest. Fishermen felt disenfranchised by what was going on. As another example, and this goes back to Mr. Gilchrist that was mentioned earlier, he went to a New England Council meeting, and the SSC met totally separately. It was not at the same time. It was not in the same building. They came and they gave a report which nobody in the room understood, and then they left. So there was no interaction with the fishermen. The fishermen distrusted the science. They distrusted the management measures that were based on the science. So what we're trying to do is get, again, not to keep harping on the Alaska model, but try and get other councils and their SSCs to be more responsive to the people that are being regulated. Also, the other thing that ties into that is the 2006 amendments gave significant more power to the SSCs. The councils now cannot exceed the harvest levels recommended by the SSC. So the SSC, which in the past was giving recommendations, now is giving binding recommendations. So it needs a little more transparency. It needs a little more interaction with the fishing community.
Thanks, Dave.
I would just say we have members on our side of the aisle on the committee that I don't think would disagree with the idea of transparency in that regard. But their concerns about transparency are not necessarily related to SSCs, but related to how the council operates, and in particular the Western Pacific Council. We have members on our committee who feel like they have to go to the council office if they want to get the transcript. It's not available online. It's not available they're not streaming. So we have certain members who have really focused on that and want to have a more available, because if you live in the CNMI, for example, you have to go a long way to get to Honolulu to look at a transcript of a council meeting. So I think there are issues in that regard as well. Given the advances that we have in technology, it seems fairly simple that a lot of that material should be more readily available.
Thank you. Any other comments on that issue? So I think it was in Penny's presentation we saw a kind of a scary diagram of the NEPA process. A big issue. It was part of the 2006 reauthorization, and I'd like to ask your comments about progress in meeting those mandates and how that plays into this new round of reauthorization.
Well, I'll start again. In 2006, we told the agency that they needed to redraft their NEPA guidelines to make them match Magnuson. It's now 2014 and they have not yet done it. So there are a lot of members who think that the process is duplicative, it adds extra time, potentially the administration can add new options that were not even looked at by the council. I remember testimony that Chris Oliver gave years ago where he brought in 1 year's worth of NEPA documents, and we piled them up in front of Mr. Young, and he called it the Great Wall of NEPA. There was a 7,000-page programmatic EIS that NOAA took a look at and said there were so many uncertainties that they needed to do it every single year. They couldn't use that as a basis document. So that's ridiculous. So there are a lot of members who think that needs to be dealt with, whether making the councils do more things to make sure that they're meeting the underlying goals of NEPA. That's one option that we've looked at. So we're continuing to discuss it, but it's an issue that a lot of our members care very deeply about.
An issue too, on the Senate side, in our discussion draft, there is language to make sure that the implementation that was mandated in the previous reauthorization draft is actually done. So we want to strengthen that and try to push that forward too.
Sorry, I would just say that while there are many members that think that the two processes are duplicative, they're not. They're actually, the requirements under the two laws are, in fact, have many differences. And while I think, agree that a lot of members want to see those processes better aligned, and frankly, what was asked for in 2006 really wasn't done, I think that there's a lot of people who would be concerned with a solution that just says Magnuson is sufficient to comply with NEPA.
Nikki?
I don't necessarily want to speak to the specific language in either of the bills, but I will say, as we haven't said it yet, that we don't hear this issue frequently from this region, and when we do, it's on a long list of maybe someday, if it's really going to open up Magnuson, here's 20 things that might be of interest. But by far, the number one message from, harvesters, processors, NGOs, and many tribes is, please just change the date. Leave the bill as it is. Things are working. Things that don't work, we have a council process that does a great job of addressing issues. Let's think about keeping our eye on the ball here and protecting this piece of legislation that's done so many good things. So I think I just want to be on record there. My boss has said that pretty much every time she has a microphone in the Commerce Committee these days. But that's something that we hear loud and clear from everybody. So I just, I think that should be out there. Thanks.
I guess to expand this a little bit, the managing fisheries under Magnuson does mean also managing under a number of other laws, ESA, MMPA, APA, as well as some international treaties. What have you heard, sort of what's on the table relative to the relationship between managing under Magnuson and any of the other applicable laws or treaties?
The House bill addressed a couple of those issues. One was that under the Endangered Species Act, if you're going to make restrictions on fisheries that are managed under an FMP, it needs to go through the council process. We're working to refine that language a little bit more, but one of the other issues that's come up is with the Marine Sanctuary Act and with the Antiquities Act, there are an awful lot of areas that are being either closed or managed under a different statute. I remember this was an issue back in 2006 again, and Senator Inouye had asked NOAA for a clarification of the roles between the Magnuson Act and the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. And what NOAA provided was a 12-page document to clarify the relationship, which included a two-page flow chart. So that didn't really clarify it. So what we've done in the House bill is we've said that the Magnuson Act will allow the councils to manage throughout the range of the fisheries, despite the Antiquities Act and the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. That's not without controversy, though.
Yes, I was going to say, as you can imagine, that's extremely controversial in some camps. But I think what we're hearing more about is issues of international fisheries, and I think that was raised earlier. We're hearing a lot about how, I liked what Sam was talking about, how do we export our management scheme, if you will. And I think that the changes in 2006 can't be underestimated, the changes to sort of bolster what RFMOs do by giving us leverage in terms of blocking imports from countries that, a lot of people don't know that we have that capability, actually. To block imports from countries that aren't complying or comporting with RFMOs that we're party to and they're also party to. And I think that's why we have a couple of other pieces of legislation right now, like the, it's called the IUU bill. It has a different name, but it's a bill that's been around for several Congresses to try and harmonize penalties under many of the different RFMOs that the U.S. is party to, but also strengthen the U.S. in terms of its ability to participate in those international agreements and make sure that our fishermen who do live by a very high standard of management are not disadvantaged against other countries where the fishing industry may not be playing by the same rules.
Just to add on, there are minor differences of opinion on the IUU bill, and I think there are things that we could easily work out. The biggest problem that we have is when we move a bill to the House floor, we have to take it through CBO, and CBO scores it. They estimate how much it's going to cost the federal government. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, CBO scored that bill at costing $71 million over 5 years. So one of the problems we have is a lot of times when CBO gets a bill, they call the agency and say, how much is this going to cost you to implement? And in the case of the IUU bill, what we understand is NOAA said, oh, we're going to have to set up this new bureaucracy, and we're going to have all these new enforcement agents, and it's going to cost us a lot of money, which undermines us and our ability to move a bill. So policy-wise, I don't think there are big differences, but how we fund it is going to be a problem.
Any other comments on this one? So data. Electronic monitoring is a very hot topic. We're hanging a lot of hope on this as a tool to improve our ability to collect fisheries-dependent data while hopefully reducing costs. How and to what extent can the Magnuson reauthorization process serve as a vehicle or a lever to move implementation of electronic monitoring along?
I'll just say that for the Pacific Council, which manages fisheries off Oregon, my boss is very, very interested and concerned about electronic monitoring and the ability for the councils to be able to, redundant, sorry, but the ability of the councils to use electronic monitoring. And in the case of the Pacific Council, and Dorothy can correct me, they want to use electronic monitoring for both data and for enforcement purposes. And I think that that's been a discussion that we've been having, Dave and I and our members on our committee, about how to promote the use of electronic monitoring, and also to give the councils the ability to use it for, not mandate it for one purpose or the other, but let councils regionally use it for the purposes that they think it's most appropriate for.
Electronic monitoring is very important to many Alaska constituents. We both need the data, but we also have to address the concerns of especially small boat fishermen, who it's hard to accept a human onboard observer for an extended period of time. They don't have the bunk space, whatever, if you're on a small halibut boat. How do we get that data? Electronic monitoring offers a lot of opportunities. I know the North Pacific Council's been working on this over the years. I know NOAA has as well. Our bill includes language trying to enhance that effort, to move it forward, as well as better integrate that data and make sure that the data that is coming from EM is meeting the needs of NOAA.
Just to follow up on what Gene said, we had a provision in the House draft that we've had a number of discussions on. I think the majority and minority are on the same page on how to go on that. But going back to the red snapper example, most of the time when we're talking about electronic monitoring in the Pacific Northwest, we're talking about cameras on the boats. In the Gulf, they're talking about things like an iPhone app called iSnapper, where guys can go out, and when they catch a snapper, they take a picture of it and they send it. And there's a GPS component that tells the managers where it was caught. They can see the size of it from the picture. It's a whole new data stream that nobody thought of a couple years ago, that if the managers can figure out how to deal with the biases and how to use that information, would be hugely helpful to managers. And in the case of red snapper, where we have very little reliable recreational data collection, this would be a huge help. So encouraging the agency to move forward to accept these technologies and figure out how we can use it for management is something I think all of us are looking forward to.
So thank you for sitting at the table and describing what's on it. Lastly, I'd like to explore a little bit what lies ahead. So I'll ask a couple of trigger questions and ask for your response. So what are the potential timelines and mileposts for reauthorization going forward? How does that process address divergence of interests and objectives? And what is the likely scenario should reauthorization not be achieved by this Congress? What are the alternative paths? So really just sort of for those of us who are not really familiar with this process, how do things play out from here?
I'll be the optimist. I think we can do it this Congress. But the House has a draft out, obviously. We've had significant comments on it. We've had a number of discussions with Democrats on the committee. I think we're making real progress. There's a Senate draft out, which has gotten significant comment. I think we can get this done. There are plenty of opportunities for us to make compromises and to deal with each other's concerns. I'll just point out that the last two reauthorizations both took place late and during an election year. In fact, the 2006 bill was passed after the election and after the House chairman had lost his reelection bid. So those were dynamics that were not real helpful to getting a bill done, but we got it done. If we don't get it done this year, we see significant changes. That the chairman of the House committee is retiring, so he'll be gone, Doc Hastings from Washington. It's likely that we will have an inland chairman next time. So that doesn't help, doesn't necessarily hurt from a political standpoint. It just means the education component of getting the member up to speed on fisheries issues is higher. The Senate chairman is retiring. So both chairmen are retiring. When that happens, there's often dominoes of people moving around, taking different committees, different subcommittees. So the certainty that we have now of who's in charge and who's interested and who cares about these issues, we know. If we wait till next year, a lot of questions. So I think it's in all of our best interest to get it done this year.
From the Senate perspective, I think there are a number of issues that still remain to be worked out. I think from my remarks earlier today, there were obviously, even for people who've reviewed the Senate discussion draft, there are a lot of issues that are controversial, that raise a lot of people's attention, and the like. I think these need to be discussed fully and vetted out. Senator Begich has asked for comments on the discussion draft by mid-May, and from there we're going to work on a second draft. And see how far we can move forward. If it doesn't happen during this Congress, I agree with what Nikki said earlier. Is that major changes from our perspective, from Alaska's perspective especially, are not necessary. Life will go on. I think it's good to see if there are ways to move the ball forward to try to address the growing changes. There's a lot of talk earlier today about how Magnuson is an evolving process and the like. There's no specific end, but there are always improvements and changes that can be made. I think we can still move forward along those lines, but first have to work through these current issues that are on our plate.
Thanks, Bob.
I don't know what will happen. I have no idea. But I do know one thing, and I think a lot of people don't understand this. When an authorization expires, it doesn't mean the money goes away. We don't have enough money, but the money still comes. So I think that's just an important thing, and maybe most people in this room know that. But there are, I think, sometimes I run into people who think that if the authorization has expired, that there's no funding for the program, and that's not the case. So that is just one important thing to note.
Thank you. Nikki, do you have any?
I'll just echo what Bob said. I think, the senator values a very deliberative, science-based process, and I think there's a lot of fishery science and fishery management is hard, and that means we need to take a long look at every single little word and every bill everywhere, all the time, past bills, future bills, current drafts, to try to make sure that we're sure at what we're doing. So it's hopefully we'll continue to have a long deliberative process to make sure we're coming out with the best bill possible. And I think part of that is hearing from everybody here, both academics, of course, thank you, UW, but also, industry, tribes, subsistence users, NGOs, NOAA. This should be a team effort. It shouldn't just be a 3,000 mile away crazy process. So thanks for having us here today, and please bug us at lunch. Yeah.
During the first Q&A, there was a question about how the council lines were drawn. And I got an email from my mentor in fisheries management, my first boss, Jeff Pike, who told me that, in fact, on the East Coast, it was supposed to be from Canada to Cape Hatteras, and that the line was going to be drawn south of there, and that there was a congressman on the fisheries subcommittee from New Jersey, ranking Republican member, and he was insistent upon getting his own council, and that is how the Mid-Atlantic Council was born. So it is about politics, okay? That's the bottom line.
So I will look to our panel for any last comments.
It's all about the politics.
All about the politics. So I would really like to thank Jean and Bob and Nikki and Dave for their good sportsmanship and participation in this panel. Thanks very much.